afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this EPC policy dialogue, which is going to be looking at 2025 as a very decisive year for Ukraine. We have so many things to talk about today. I'm not sure where we can actually start because there's so many issues. We're going to be looking at the situation in Ukraine on the battlefield. We're going to be looking at the incoming Trump administration vis-a-vis the potential ceasefire that he wants to bring about between Russia and Ukraine, what that could look like, how are we going to get there, how is Ukraine going to be prepared for that. Ukraine needs to be doing that from a position of strength. And then security guarantees, what are they going to look like? What is Europe's role going to be in this? What Europe should actually be doing? So there's many things that we have to talk about today. And it's very fortunate that we have two excellent speakers with us today who have also given us the pleasure of their analysis on other EPC events vis-a-vis Ukraine. First of all, Andriy Zagorodnyuk, who's chairman of the Center for Defense Strategies and former Minister of Defense of Ukraine. Welcome to you, Andriy. Thank you very much for joining us again here in EPC. And Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who's the former commanding general of the US Army Europe, as a NATO senior mentor for logistics and also a senior advisor to the Human Rights First organization. Thank you as well, Ben, because you've also been on EPC many times, so it's a real pleasure to have you here with us today. But I'd like to start with you, Andriy, if you don't mind. I want to start with looking at the situation on the battlefield on the front, because there's been a lot of reports, a lot of stories about how increasingly fragile the front line is, the pressure that Ukrainian troops are increasingly under on the front line, and the ongoing pressure from the side of Russia. We've seen it again actually today. Some stories about how Russia is pushing through in some areas. If you could give us a snapshot, a picture of how you see the situation on the ground, that would be, I think this would be a good starting point, and then Ben can come in after you.
Thank you. I have to just remind whoever doesn't know that we publish daily reports from the front. They are available free of charge on Substack. So please, it's called CDS Daily Brief, Center for Defense Strategies Daily Brief. It's free. And we have our own sources because some of our experts are currently in the units on the front. So we do have some fact checking and so on. The situation is extremely difficult in a number of the areas, obviously, particularly in Donbas region, but it's not just that, but there particularly. The overall Russians have developed a tactic which would be unacceptable for Ukraine and any other nation, any other democratic nation, but they apply it, and they are, I can't say succeeding because this is a very subjective term. We traditionally disagree with the term winning because a lot of articles and some of the analyst statements saying that Russia is currently winning. That's a very speculative term. First of all, winning is not a military term. It's we're talking about operations and talking about missions and campaigns, and so far Russia is not winning any of their operations and any of their campaigns. Their operational goals are not yet achieved, and there is a great doubt that they will be achieved in a foreseeable future. But at the same time, they do progress. As you know, the progress over the last year was 3,600 square kilometers. It would be wrong to say whether this is a lot or not a lot. Because it's a Ukrainian territory and these are lives of Ukrainian people, and these are villages which Ukrainian people inhabit or inhabited. And of course, loss of that territory is tragic for us. At the same time, we need to understand what 3,600 kilometer means. it means that if you put it on a square, that's 60 by 60 kilometers. So essentially, this is basically all what Russian war machine can do. So imagine the war machine with the massive budget, with a third budget in the world, which increased substantially for the last couple of years. That's a budget of which right now we do suspect that this is not like 1/3 as Russian official data are saying. We do believe that this is at least 40%. And most likely in 2025, that will be close to 50% of all their state budget would be one way or the other related to the war. Not necessarily like a direct troops support, but whatever is related to the war, compensations, payments, and so on. So essentially, Russian war economy switched to half of its ability to the supporting the war. Their defense industry is working 24/7. They lose now at least 1,500 people a day in casualties, at least some, quite often much more. They bring Korean troops, North Korean troops, and so on and so on. And basically, that's that territory which they occupied last year. That's all they could do. It's uncomparably smaller than what Ukraine liberated in 2022. And so this is the issue which lots of people still struggling about, is basically like what exactly is happening, particularly since Ukraine is exhausted and Ukraine is struggling, and Ukrainian troops are holding in many cases basically on their courage. And on their like essentially like understanding that behind them there is like the country where their family live. So why this is happening and what happened? Because since we still see some substantial support, at least this year, why there is such a change? And we could discuss this today, because we need to understand that Ukraine is fighting a war which no Western army or where no Western military would ever choose to fight. Ukraine still doesn't have a single competitive aircraft. And ask any general, particularly, we can talk obviously to Ben, but I'm sure that any NATO general, if you ask like whether they would be happy to fight the war without a competitive aviation, the answer would be no. And also there is still prohibitions on using and limitations on using certain weapons, and there is a still predominant focus on the infantry and predominant focus on the all operations in a tactical depth from 0 to 30 kilometers. This is the war, despite for like high-tech equipment such as EW and drones, which we obviously see in unprecedented quantity, which are defining the battlefield to a great extent. The rest of the war of like setting, it more resembles World War I or Iran-Iraq 1980-1988. So it's clearly not a modern war, and it's clearly the war which grinds away Ukrainian troops and their abilities. And so the thing is that addressing this issue which we currently have cannot be without addressing the fact that we always considered that setting as temporary until we get aviation, until we get the ability to strike deep. But that temporary already lasts for almost 3 years. So that's where we are. So essentially, Ukraine compensates the absence of modern warfare techniques and technologies with the lives of people, and that creates the problem with lack of personnel, sometimes lack of training for personnel. It's because it overcompensates with infantry the shortcomings of basically systems and types of weapons which it would normally require under normal circumstances. So while addressing the movements of the troops and the losses and the shortages and so on, let's not forget about the massive like imbalances of what we would normally have during this war and what we actually have on the ground. On the ground, it looks pretty grim, because we do have a trench warfare. We do have an overload of the infantry troops. And for sure that type of the war is not going to look nice, in any case. And And all we're trying to do right now, including participating in these conferences, to try to somehow to shift from that infantry war to a more modern type of the warfare. Thank you. I hope we can get back to this one sometime.
Thank you, Andriy. Maybe just a quick follow-on question.
Sure.
Related to the issue of mobilization, because we've seen in the recent weeks and days, I mean, in the news again today, Ukraine is being pressed by the partners. I saw from the US again today to lower the conscription age from 18 to 24. I mean, this is something that's been pushed back on by Ukraine so far, but do you foresee that they're going to feel obliged to have a change of approach here, or not?
Well, we certainly expecting some difficult conversations on that topic, and I'm sure that our president will have to discuss this with the partners and allies, and for sure with the change of administration. However, I have to say two things. So first of all, today's statement has been done without a future national security advisor yet visited Ukraine. And usually, like, visiting Ukraine for all high level officials adjusts the perspective, at least. Because we know why he hasn't visited, because they're not appointed yet. So it's all understandable. But I'm sure that they will have to create their position, and they will have to adjust their position, or at least like finalize their position after the visits to Ukraine, or after their like closest advisors would go to Ukraine, because the issue, and we disagreed on that with the previous administration as well, because current national security advisor Jake Sullivan also said that some issues of Ukraine in the front are related to the mobilization issues, and to the no desire to mobilize like young people and so on. The thing is that in US doctrine, in US like war fighting doctrines, including like a joint level doctrines and so on, there is a term called military challenge or military problem. It's basically when the current doctrines are not working, and you need to revise them, and you need to bring up new operating concepts. And the new operating concepts are usually like focused on how to solve the certain military challenge or military problem. So using that terminology, we can say that National Security Advisor, for example, current one, Jake Sullivan, called the shortage of personnel, and particularly some decisions on mobilization, leading to the shortage of the personnel, is the main military problem for Ukraine. At least that's how his statement sounded. And we do disagree, because we don't think that is the main military problem. We think that military problem is what I just described in the beginning of my speech, is basically the fact that this war is too focused on land, is too focused on frontal clashes, like in a World War I style, and basically grinding away the infantry. And with such an approach, it's never going to be enough, because the death toll will be always high, and the casualties toll will be always high, and there would be waves of Russians coming to our front, which we would need to beat off. And then, of course, then it's a question how many people Russia has, how many people we have, and basically what would be the difference net kind of a effect of the people against people. I don't think it's a proper military approach to look at that as the main military problem, like the shortage of personnel. I think that we would rather look at how do we fight, and then decide what should be the force structure if we decide to change the way how we fight. Because again, coming back to US doctrines, the force structure should always be concept based. So which means that like it should be based on certain operating concepts. Now, if we assume that there is like this force structure, and that force structure currently envisaged has lack of personnel, then the question, which concept do we base it on? We base it on the concept of World War I. I disagree with that. I personally think it's wrong, and I disagree with that force structure, and I disagree with that concept, because we need to fight a different war. So that's personal opinion on the and of course we do need to have mobilization, but not for that type of the war which we currently have there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andriy. I'll come back to you again in a minute, but I want to turn to you now, Ben, to get your take. Do you agree with what you've just heard from Andriy regarding the situation on the ground? I mean, to what extent has been the sort of differing, the lack of quick weapon supplies, the types of weapons that have been delivered too slowly to Ukraine by the partners, also to blame for the current, very difficult situation on the battlefield. I'd like to ask you that as the first point. Then as a follow-up, obviously, as you're an American, can you give us a comment on, I mean, what are you expecting now? I mean, the first few days of the Trump administration, I mean, we've seen already a shift in the narrative from the I'm going to resolve this war in 24 hours to 100 days or 6 months. I mean, there seems to have been a change. Right. So this is you.
I agree with everything that Andriy said, but I'm going to pile on certain things and add some things. First of all, it is bullshit that the current National Security Advisor and the future National Security Advisor are blaming the Ukrainians for not drafting young people as an excuse for Ukraine not winning the war. This is Jake Sullivan doing this. This is part of an effort by the White House over the last few months to try and whitewash their failure, the failure of the administration. By the way, I supported the Biden administration very strongly, but they failed the critical task of making it the priority to help Ukraine win. All these other things you're talking about, delivering weapons and aid and et cetera, those are policies. And you cannot have effective policy unless you have a clearly defined objective. And the Biden administration, despite all the good things they did, never, ever defined a clear strategic objective. And they never said, we want Ukraine to win, therefore we're going to do everything necessary to help them win because it's in our interest, the interest of the United States. So you end up with a terrible record of delivery, of ammunition, equipment, and of course, many allies hide behind us, while some, particularly those on the east flank of NATO, have given most of their own equipment to Ukraine. So this is about a failure to clearly define the strategic objective. And I worry that the incoming administration is making the same mistake. Number two, I loved it that Andriy just kind of put in perspective what actually has been taken by the Russians. I remember being at the Munich Security Conference last year, February 2024, when Avdiivka was finally captured after I don't know how many months and losses. And people were walking around Munich like, oh my God, Avdiivka has fallen. Well, you look at a map, Avdiivka is about as far east in Ukraine as you can possibly be. From Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, which is this other town that is referred to as the strategically vital city of Pokrovsk, it's about 65 kilometers. The Russians have not been able to go from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk in 11 months, despite having lost around 200 or 300,000 troops in that same amount of time. So how anybody that can read a map, that understands warfare, could say, oh, it looks like the Russians are winning, is absolutely without clue. And by the way, this is during a period where we, for months, failed to deliver one single round of artillery ammunition. Don't forget that back in the first half of the year. We have not used our economic power. Thank God the Biden administration just this week announced that they have sanctioned another 200 vessels of the so-called shadow fleet. Why the hell are they doing it now, their last week in office? Why didn't they do this, 3 years ago? Because it's Russia's ability to export oil and gas to India and China primarily is what keeps them in the war. And you don't have to be a graduate of Harvard Business School to be able to see that Russia's economy is in deep, deep trouble. It is being propped up by all sorts of artificial measures. And I think, like in the famous Hemingway novel, A Sun Also Rises, when somebody asked the other guy, how did you go bankrupt? He said, gradually and then suddenly. I think that's what's going to happen inside Russia, that we're going to see a collapse, because already, even in Russia, you're starting to see protests against the enormous high prices, protests against the staggering casualties they are suffering. And there's no casualties coming out of Moscow and St. Petersburg, by the way. These are the poor people that live out in the hinterland that are paying the real price. From the U.S., what do I expect? Actually, despite the being a few months ago very concerned about what a Trump administration would mean for Ukraine, there is the potential that President Trump could be persuaded to do a much better job when it comes to helping Ukraine. First of all, he's going to have a lot of leverage over Vladimir Putin that he did not have 8 years ago. President Trump is inheriting a very, very strong U.S. economy. He's got 31 allies already, most of whom, I'm talking about NATO allies, that want to help Ukraine, plus other partners. They are waiting for American leadership and impetus. He's going to benefit from the fact that the Biden administration failed to deliver $2 billion worth of equipment that's still on the table, but it's already been approved. Trump doesn't have to do a thing, and that can still go. So he can tell Putin, he said, hey, you're going to have to come to the table in a realistic way, or I'm going to let this next $2 billion go, no restrictions. They can use it how they want, where they want. I am encouraged that General Kellogg, the envoy, he's said at least two things that are positive in my mind. Number one, he said Russia cannot be trusted. That's a very important starting point for any negotiation with Russia, is to acknowledge up front, you cannot trust them. And then number two, he has emphasized the importance of Ukraine's sovereignty. So while I think he emphasizes too much, we got to stop the fighting, instead of saying we want to help Ukraine win, at least he's better than I had anticipated. And I do think that Mr. Waltz, what he said as the incoming National Security Advisor, some things were positive. He's a Russia hawk, which is good, but he clearly does not understand the manpower situation in Ukraine. I think, when I first heard about the age limit for Ukrainian conscription, I thought it was unusual. But Ukraine does not have a people shortage. There's probably 1 million women and men, military age, using the current Ukrainian standard, that could still come into the military. So this is a cultural decision by the Ukrainians on whether or not to lower the age. And I think it's terrible. It's disgusting that somebody would say, well, you're asking us to help you, but you're not willing to expose your young people. The Ukrainian government has to regain the confidence of Ukrainian people so that families will be sure that their son or daughter will not be wasted, but that they won't go to the fighting until they are properly trained, properly equipped, and put in a unit that is properly trained. And I think the government has to regain confidence of people. They don't have to reduce the age.
Thank you, Ben. It's great to hear that you're so optimistic, if that's the right word. I mean, the feeling among many European politicians doesn't seem to be so optimistic. There seems to be, a sense in the corridors here that we don't have that much leverage over Russia. So it's good to actually hear what you said. Perhaps there's too much of there's always a way of looking at things very negatively, actually, I think sometimes from Brussels. But just a quick follow-up, then I'm going to come back to you, Andriy. I mean, what do you expect to be the timeline here? Because, I mean, today we're hearing about the potential telephone call or meeting between Trump and Putin. Do you really think that's going to be in the near future? I mean, what's the sort of realistic timeline that we're looking at if we think about all the back and forth that needs to be? Because the Ukraine obviously has to be the priority, the different conversations. Does Donald Trump actually have the patience for a lot of prolonged period of discussions leading up to a potential ceasefire? And what needs to be done actually to support Ukraine, to put Ukraine in a much stronger position, apart from this package you just mentioned? Prior to that,
I disagree with the premise of your question. The premise of your question is that there has to be some kind of negotiated settlement. Why? I mean, this is not the 18th century, where the big powers are going to impose something on the smaller countries. Ukraine has a lot to say about how this goes. And I think that Donald Trump, not for moral reasons, but to be the big guy, to be the winner, versus being hung with the blame for losing Ukraine, he could be the one that actually helps Ukraine defeat Russia, because it's in America's interest. It's in Europe's interest. The Chinese need to see that we have the political will and the industrial capacity to defeat Russia. It will be much more difficult to do that against China. So the Chinese need to see that we are serious and have those kind of capabilities. And I think Trump could be persuaded. So I'm just rejecting the premise that we have no choice but to force Ukraine to accept some kind of negotiated settlement. Now, let's assume that the Ukrainian government says, yes, we're worried about the damage to our population, but the Ukrainians also know that if there's anything where Russia is rewarded by keeping Crimea, for example, or keeping the 20% of Ukraine, and by the way, for all these people that are wetting themselves in Brussels, after 11 years of war with every advantage, Russia only controls 20% of Ukraine. And that's without us actually committing to helping Ukraine win. We haven't even tried. So anyway, but let's just assume that, so I can answer your question. Ukraine agrees, yes, we'll have a negotiation, but here's our conditions. President Trump, presidential candidate Trump said, I'll solve it in 24 hours before I get inaugurated. Obviously, that's not going to happen. Mr. General Kellogg has already said minimum 100 days. So I would not bank on any estimate of time coming from any side. Vladimir Putin has no interest in doing this as long as he believes we're going to quit, because he doesn't care about casualties. Not really, except casualties that might come from Moscow or St. Petersburg. So as long as he sees that we're anxious to get to a negotiated outcome, he's just going to keep sending golf carts full of unlucky soldiers into the attack against Ukrainian defenders.
Thank you. I wasn't trying to insinuate that Ukraine should be forced into a settlement, because I don't agree with that at all. I think it would be a recipe for
a disaster. I didn't think you were insinuating that.
No, definitely not. But I want to come back to you now, Andriy. I want to get your sort of how do you see the sort of the conversations that have already taken place between Ukraine and the incoming Trump administration? I mean, since the early days, following the election until now, have you seen a shift? And from a Ukrainian perspective, we've heard President Zelensky say on several occasions that there needs to be like rock solid security guarantees in place before there can be any sort of final agreement reached. For you, apart from the NATO membership, which is the most obvious security guarantee that Ukraine would need, what would you see as something, an alternative to that? Something else that Ukraine could potentially find acceptable.
Right. Thank you, Amanda. I would like to add just one thing to the previous question. So if we are seriously thinking that Putin will consider stopping the war one way or the other, he needs to face a very credible perspective of something really terrible happening to them in the case if he doesn't stop the war. So it's basically like a negative alternative to negotiated agreement. I don't think that he is capable of actually reaching any agreement, just personally, because he is not that type of a guy. If he feels strong, he would be pushing till the end. If he feels weak, he would be trying to rebuild his position and so on. But if there is, in this reality, if there is any percentage, if there is any chance for him to actually stop the war, he will do it only in the case if he sees that very, very bad consequences of not stopping the war. And these consequences can exist in economic realm. So basically, the economic warfare measures could be built up so that, his economy is on the brink of disaster and so on, which it is already. but I mean that it could be kind of increased. And of course, military, because again, economic itself without military argument will not work. So what I'm trying to say is that if this alternative is not built up, so basically, if for him not stopping the war is not going to lead to any disastrous consequences immediately, and credibility and evidence of these disastrous consequences should be very clear to him, not to us, not to anybody else, not to Donald Trump, to Putin specifically. He needs to understand the probability of those consequences. So if these consequences are not there, or he doesn't see them, he's not going to stop, because there's like no point. If he can get more from Ukraine, he will. And so that's the situation. So timing is completely irrelevant here. What is relevant is that what people do during that time, whether they build up that alternative, that negative alternative for negotiation to him, or they're not building. And it will be very difficult to do, and it would require resolution, and it would require beefing up Ukraine's defense capabilities and so on. And then there is a question whether whether U.S. administration would be actually have appetite to that. Now, regarding we clearly understand that this war is not about territory. This war is not about Donbass. This war about much bigger things. First of all, that's existence of Ukraine, which is which Putin wants to seize. But it's also about existence of the security architecture in Europe and generally around the world. It's about existence of international law, and so on and so on. All these things. And we clearly understand that if Putin stops the war, he stops it because of these credible alternatives, not because he changes his mind about everything. So we can clearly understand that if this cessation, for whatever reasons, happens, he will use that time in order to build up and to strike again. And then the question is, what deterrence we need to build in order for that build up to be unsuccessful, or strike to be unsuccessful? And of course, it needs to reflect the power of Russia, which especially the one which are going to amass before their economy collapses. So there would be still their war machine, their production machine would be still building up. And they may be actually building up forces, they may be building up stocks of weapons, stocks of ammunition, and so on, in order to kind of throw everything and at some point in the future to Ukraine. And we need to make sure that this campaign would be unsuccessful. So we need to build up that kind of a combination of Ukrainian capabilities and some capabilities coming from the West, or at least resources coming to the West, so we can create something which would hold Russia. Nobody seriously can imagine that doing successfully outside of NATO. And so the question, what is alternative to NATO? There's no alternative to NATO. I mean, because seriously, to build up that power which would hold Russia or be a deterrent to Russia outside of NATO would be extremely difficult, extremely expensive. It would require a lot of money for sustaining those capabilities, and it would be really tough. And then the question, to which extent the allies would be willing to provide some participation, for example, with the air defense, particularly with high-ticket items such as air defense, such as tactical aviation, presence in Ukraine, in order to enable Ukraine to actually have that sort of capable deterrence. That's still a question. The agreements which we have on the bilateral collaboration, they're extremely general. They're like very, very ambiguous. So they're like basically political statements. So that force design, which would be deterrent to Russia, is a massive force, and it's tough to imagine it's outside of NATO, but it has to be done if NATO is not on the table, at least to some extent.
Thank you, Andriy. I would like to come back to you now, Ben, about the issue of NATO membership. I mean, do you agree that this is something that is going to remain off the table for the time being, or is there some other way that can be sort of partially compensated? by other means in terms of security guarantee? And my second question would be to you about the role actually of Europeans, because there's been quite a lot of talk about the potential of European countries actually deploying to a future demilitarized zone in Ukraine, acting as a sort of as a force there. Do you believe that European countries actually have the capacity and the capabilities to do that effectively, particularly given how long it would take to mobilize then, never mind whether the Russians would take that seriously, I don't know. So I'd like to ask that question to you. I'd also like to ask the audience to please put your questions. I forgot to mention that at the beginning of the show. There's a Q&A box, so you can please put your questions there.
Okay, so first of all, NATO membership. NATO will get better the minute that Ukraine becomes a member. It will add hundreds of thousands of experienced soldiers who have stopped Russia without all the modern tools, and yet they stopped Russia. Ukraine has changed the character of naval warfare. They have shown us how to use drones. We will get better the minute that Ukraine joins the alliance. Now, it's not going to happen until the United States. The President of the United States says it is in our interest that we do this. President Biden was not willing to do it because I think the Biden administration was paralyzed by a unreasonable fear that Russia might somehow use a nuclear weapon. That contributed to all the bad decisions they made. The Trump administration would have to think, what is our strategic objective for this war? And to think holistically about European security and why it's our advantage, the advantage of the United States from an economic standpoint, a security standpoint, and for deterring China to be willing to do this. Until the American president puts his shoulder to the wheel, it's just not going to happen. I know there are different formulas out there, but you've got several European countries that, for whatever reason, are not willing to do it, and they can all hide behind the United States until the U.S. is willing to do it. So hopefully we will get over this emotional hurdle, but it really is pathetic in my mind. Now, to the question of, okay, if there's no NATO membership, then we have to be honest, there really is no security guarantee for Ukraine unless we put a lot of well-trained, well-armed soldiers, including Europeans and Americans, into Ukraine at the invitation of Ukraine. Now, we have done this before. The Dayton Peace Accord in 1995 was implemented by the NATO IFOR, the implementation force. This was a very, very powerful, well-trained military force. It had unity of command. It had a clear mission statement, and it had rules of engagement. That's why it was so successful compared to the UN predecessor, even though most of the same nations from the UNPROFOR were part of IFOR. And that would be my point. You know, people talk about peacekeeping or security guarantees for Ukraine. There has to be these things. And I know, of course, Jamie Shea is listening, or he's part of your organization. Jamie had a front row seat, was part of the process when NATO went through this with Secretary General Solana, and General Jawan was the Supreme Allied Commander. And I mean, this was a force that had all the things necessary so that the Serbs and others, Croatians, Bosnians, nobody would challenge IFOR. So if we send any kind of force into Ukraine at the invitation of Ukraine, it has to be a real force that the Russians know that if they ever tested it, that they would get crushed. And you can be sure that Russia will test it, just as they've done after Minsk I and Minsk II. They violate every single agreement. And so if we send a force in there, they've got to have air power, large land forces, drones, counter drones, air missile defense, all of that. If they go in there with a bunch of blue helmets and rifles, they will get crushed.
Thank you, Ben. I'd like to come back to you again, Andriy, as we don't have any questions from the audience yet. I would encourage them to put them into the box. There's also been some potential speculation around a more international force being deployed into Ukraine, including potentially some countries from the global south. I'm guessing it's based on the premise as well that the Russians are unlikely to attack some of the countries from the global south who are present in other missions around the world. How would you view this sort of deployment as something that could be beneficial? It could be more, let's say, functional than perhaps an EU deployment, or something that could be quite difficult to actually carry out?
Every war is different, and every operational environment is different. And it's different because of the geography, it's different because of the forces design, forces constitution from both sides. It's different because of the weapon systems employed, particularly if there is a gap of like a couple tens of years between these the different events, and because the weapons develop and so on. So let's assume that there are some land forces are showing up in Ukraine by invitation, as Ben very correctly stated. So where are they going to go? We have a front line of about 1,000 kilometers, that's active part. Then we have another 500 kilometers, which is inactive part, but can be active in any point of time. Then we have a border with Belarus over about 1,000 kilometers, which can in any moment become, not on each part, because there's some very difficult parts to cross, but in some parts they're easy. So we have this like a massive, like a land connection to Russia, and then maritime domain, obviously. And the question is do we assume that we will bring that many troops to Ukraine to actually secure? That's the first challenge. Second challenge, we obviously understand that Russians are using all kinds of airborne equipment, like on a daily basis to Ukraine. So we're talking about Shahed drones, we're talking about missiles, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, all that type of stuff. So unless we assume that there is like air defense coming or bumping up, these troops simply may witness how the planes and rockets and drones and everything flying over their head without any chances to do anything about that. And if they're stationed, for example, around Kharkiv, they may see Kharkiv being destroyed, and they're still there, and they may not be even attacked, those troops. And Russians would still do the damage and so on. So I would probably suggest to consider, and again, I'm not in a position to insist or anything, but just to suggest to consider for these troops not to be trying to replicate the peacekeeping forces in other conflicts, because other conflicts had much shorter, line of contact and much weaker other side than Russia. Maybe I would suggest to consider that as a sort of compensation of shortcomings of Ukrainian forces. So, for instance, as I just said in the beginning of the seminar, Ukraine still, after 3 years of war and hundreds of billions of invested money, not a single competitive aircraft, not a single one. So we cannot fight on the front line because Russian air defense is there, Russian aviation is there, and so on and so on. So addressing those issues, or being able at least to address those issues, would present a credible threat for Russians that perhaps they shouldn't be, starting the hostilities in that area, and maybe that force would actually have a deterrent effect in this case. They may actually have a deterrent effect if they can credibly, threaten Russian forces in a close proximity, rather than just stay there, expecting that Russians troops may actually start moving. If the Russian troops will start moving, imagine what's going to happen if they continue human wave tactics. And just sending hundreds of thousands just to die, like 90% casualty rate, 95% casualty rate. I mean, what the peacekeeping forces, what these forces would do, actually, it's very difficult to deal with that tactic. Serbians didn't do those tactics, and many other conflicts didn't. So, and again, I'm not trying to be negative. I think that participation of Western forces in Ukraine stability has to be. I mean, maybe this is the solution, but again, referring to the traditional doctrines, you know, the force constitution has to be a threat informed, because it has to be a response to the specific threat in this particular conflict, and it's very difficult to design such force. But yeah, I mean, we can try for sure.
Thank you, Andriy. I'd like to follow up with a second question, because I mean you're in Ukraine, but do you still sometimes have the perception that people in Europe don't view the war as their war, that it's still viewed very much as a Ukrainian war, a war that's the responsibility of Ukraine? I mean, not least, I mean, public opinion. I mean, does more need to be done, at least from the side of Europe, to again sort of reiterate the security, the larger security implications for Europe of Russia's war in Ukraine? Because I mean, I'm sitting in Brussels. I mean, obviously this is quite unique, but if you go to some other countries, Spain, Portugal, wherever, you barely hear anything about the war. So how important is this, that the war is continually flagged up? Because I also have the sense as well that now President Trump is coming into office, perhaps to a certain degree, the foot's been taken off the accelerator a bit, because some people think, oh, Trump's coming, we may not like him that much, but they seem to be on a path to end the war. I don't know whether this is a perception in Ukraine or not, but I'd be interested to know.
People in Ukraine certainly are very much supporting the idea of ending the war. The issue is that even intuitively, we understand that unless they end with some sustainable perspective, it's not going to be the end. Temporary ceasefire, particularly if it's enabled by depriving Ukraine from ability to defend itself, it's not the end of the war. So let's not clearly mix. What Trump is saying essentially is a correct thing. He says, like, let's end this war. Like, who would say no? I mean, certainly he shouldn't convince us that this is a good thing to end this war. But then the question is that if there are some people who are commenting then that from his upcoming administration, or generally from the Republican Party, or generally from United States or anywhere else in the world, if they're saying, well, in order to end the war, let's convince Ukraine that it has to seize some territories. Well, that's clearly a deviation from the overall goal, because seizing territories is not going to end the war. It will actually enhance the war, because Putin will be emboldened by his own success of getting new territories, even if it's theoretically possible. And then he definitely is not going to stop. So there are a lot of misunderstandings about what is necessary to end the war. And I had a call from we know, for example, that in UK people are dominantly for pro-Ukrainian, and they absolutely support Ukraine, and this is one of the highest rates of support around the world. But at the same time, I had a call from BBC journalists who said what Ukraine is going to give up, because if Ukraine doesn't give up, certainly and a compromise on the territory, certainly that's a prerequisite for peace. And I only could just ask him, why on earth do you think that, and who told it, and where it's written that this is like a prerequisite for peace? Particularly if Putin is not about the territory, he's about much bigger things, as we discussed. So yeah, there are misunderstandings all around, Europe, UK, United States, about what's going on. And certainly lots of people do still believe that this is a regional conflict, which is only matters for the regional powers. And some people think that this is a conflict between the neighbors who just cannot decide on territory, etc., etc. Explaining that properly, it's always important, because there are a friend of mine, son in United States was tasked to write a thesis how Ukrainian NATO ambitions led to the war. And the person and the teacher, he was actually pro-Ukrainian. He thought that this is really like the fact that Ukraine gets to try to get to NATO, it actually led to the war. We would call it victim blaming. We would call it a misconception on what this is all about. And of course, many people here in the audience, they know that this is not the case. But yeah, there are lots of misunderstandings in a wider audience, addressing which important as never.
I would call it blatant disinformation, which unfortunately is, widespread everywhere. And we still repeatedly hear this point about Ukraine's NATO aspirations, when we all know that NATO membership was never popular in Ukraine at all.
Until 2018, actually. We only formally decided to join NATO in 2018. Yeah, before that, Ukraine was like legally neutral country.
Absolutely. I saw that Mr. Lars Holgaard said that he had a question. I'm not sure whether he wants to he didn't write it, but maybe he wants to say it personally if he's still in the call. I don't know, Tatiana, if you're there, would you be able to unmute him if he has the question? No? Okay, otherwise I'm going to...
Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Yes, thank you very much. It's a very interesting discussion. No, it was because Mr. Zagorodnyuk, I don't think the pronunciation is the best, has said for 2 times now that Ukraine does not have any planes to defend itself or to even attack, do a counterattack. And I'm a bit puzzled about that because we've seen now that, and myself, I'm a Dane, so I know that, but both Denmark and the Netherlands have actually offered and supplied Ukraine with several F-16 airplanes, as well as participated in training the pilots from Ukraine. So what's the situation? Are the planes not in order, or are the pilots still not as far in their training that they can go and use the planes? I know that it takes a lot of years normally to be able to use these complicated planes, but in this case here we're in a special situation, and the time is of the essence. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, sir, for asking this. And first of all, our huge appreciation to people and the governments of those countries which provided F-16s. F-16s are fantastic planes, and we do use them, and they're flying on a daily basis almost, and they're participating in the missions. However, what I said that Ukraine doesn't have a competitive planes. So the word competitive is the key here. Because the planes which Ukraine has, including F-16s, they're radars and they're like fire systems, basically. Like they're not, particularly their radars. They don't allow to compete with Russian newest planes, which are currently deployed to the battlefield. And so, due to that, Russia is essentially has a better situation awareness in the line of contact, and that allows them to use the ground-based and air-based air defense, and basically to keep this aviation away. The answer to this problem would be to have newer planes. And I know that Ukraine is in negotiations with several countries in Europe about the newer planes, which would have better radars. But it's still in discussions, and it's still in a process, and still there are some activities. But as of today, 13th of January, none of the planes supplied, including by the Western coalition, are actually like that competitive in a direct combat with the Russian newest Russian aircrafts.
Thank you.
So I'm sorry, and so that's why I'm sorry. We still use them. We still use them as in the case if we can assure that there are opportunities to quickly get into the area, but that's extremely risky deployments and missions. And also we use them very actively for air defense purposes when the Russian rockets are actually crossing the border and crossing the line of contact and getting to Ukrainian territory. That's where the F-16s are deployed right now, and they're showing a remarkable success. So they are practically still very used. But it's not that like we can change the dynamics in the line of contact with this issue.
Thank you, Andriy. I want to put the last question here to both of you. I mean, I know you only have a few minutes, Ben. From Anonymous, the sort of D-Day question: what would happen if US support was suddenly came to an end? I mean, what's the worst case scenario? And I would add to that: is in Europe any way ready to step in and take over that?
The worst case scenario is that Europe would fail to defend itself because look, Europe provides over half of what goes to Ukraine already. And that's without most of Europe's defense industry or most of Europe's governments actually motivating and accelerating the mobilization of its own defense industry. I visited a German plant a couple of months ago. They're sitting on top of excess capacity, but they said we're waiting on orders from the government to produce more things. So the governments have to muster the political will to start producing what's needed. So it doesn't have to be a disaster if the U.S. just quits. I mean, remember, we went almost, I think, 7 months without delivering anything. So Europe, particularly Germany, will be the biggest loser if Ukraine were to fail, because you'll have millions more refugees. Russia will use the time to rebuild. They'll absorb Ukrainian troops that were captured. So I think it does feel like more and more European leaders, led by Dr. von der Leyen, Kaja Kallas, and Andrius Kubilius, people like this, they understand what's at stake. Eastern Europeans are not confused about the threat. And fortunately, Prime Minister Meloni, she's also not confused about the threat. So it doesn't have to be a disaster. It will be a disaster for the United States and for our credibility.
That's true. But over here, the discussion is how we're going to pay for the weapons. You know, they're looking for the bonds, defense bonds or whatnot, to be able to buy weapons, which is taking a hell of a long time. I know you need to go, but I would like Andriy also to comment on that, and also the very last question that came in, asking how can the EU guarantee they get a seat at the table? I mean, can't they just force themselves into the table? What's your take, Andriy, and then Ben, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
There is a substantial pressure in DC right now, in Washington, to that Ukraine and in EU as well is actually at the table, because this is indeed a European. It's a European business as well, and yeah, and so the thing is that I don't think that's, you know, there are scenarios where they cannot be imposed, and particularly since President-elect Trump constantly talking about that Europe has to pay for a lot of these things, and he obviously. You know, we can question some of the assumptions and some of the numbers and some of the statements, but generally speaking, he's pressuring constantly on the fact that this is a European matter, and in this case, Europe has to have a seat at the table if it's a European matter. So basically, but for Ukraine, it goes without saying. I don't want to even comment on that, because there is this rule, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And of course, there are enough people in the upcoming administration who might have never heard of that rule. So it's partly our job to make sure that they do.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Ben, last word.
Yeah, well, first of all, you're sitting on hundreds and hundreds of millions of euro of frozen Russian assets that will help pay for things. So this is political will. This is not availability of money. This is political will. And by the way, I live here in beautiful Frankfurt. I have not noticed any decrease in the number of people going on ski holidays or going to Mallorca. So, you know, people are plenty of money to spend. So this is about, do politicians have the backbone and the courage to explain to their own citizens why this is important? That this is not about charity for Ukraine. This is about for the future of security in Europe and around the world. So it's all political will. And the Ukrainians are not going to quit. I mean, they know what happens when they quit. And I just hope that enough European leaders will step up. And I hope my own country, by the way, the Congress, There are a lot of Republican leaders in the Congress that are pro-Ukraine, pro-NATO, pro-transatlantic. So I would not assume that the Congress will just stand by, that they will play a key role here.
Right.
Thank you. And I think that's a very positive note to end on. We all know what needs to be done. That needs to be done quickly. We all know that Ukraine needs to, there needs to be a just end to this war. There needs to be an end where we'll never see the Russians invade Ukraine or any other country in its neighborhood or elsewhere again. And people need to really understand what needs to be done. I'm not sure that everybody really does understand that yet, but I think we are getting there. I would like to thank both of you very much for joining us here on the EPC. It's always great to have you to hear your insights and to share your views. We look forward to hosting you again in the future. And we'll have more news in the next few weeks after Trump finally takes a seat in the White House. And until then, everybody, please continue to support Ukraine. Slava Ukraina, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Thank you.